It's day 66. We're going to look at graphical user interfaces in tkinter. Now, so far, all the code we've done has been command line based. So what that really means is that it's all text output. And let's be honest, very few of us have used an entirely text-based output computer since about 1984. So let's start building actual graphical user interfaces. Here's a little disclaimer. The next 4 days are all about user interface design using tkinter. It is a little bit of a 90s technology. And if at any point in the next few days you're really not feeling this UI design, skip ahead. Mark everything as complete until you get to day 70 when we'll be back on the proper stuff again. There's absolutely nothing wrong with skipping ahead with this. We'll be looking at proper web-based UI design in a few lessons time anyway. This is just to get a taster for it in case you want to go and do UI design for app development later on. Now Python by itself doesn't support them, but one library does. And in fact, there are a few different libraries for user interfaces. We're going to look at one of the more popular ones to start with, which is tkinter. When you start a tkinter project in Replit, you get some boilerplate code, which is on the screen at the moment. So let's run it and see what we get from that. When it runs, it generates the user interface here. We've got a button that says click me and a bit of text that says hello world. So let's see what's building what here. Our first line imports tkinter as tk because tkinter is a little bit long to type, so we can type tk dot to access the elements. You create a window with a title, and in this case hello world is the title, so let's change that. The geometry is the size of it, so 300 pixels by 300 pixels. Looks like we could go wider here. So if we change it to 400 by 200, we get a slightly wider and a slightly shorter window, which is quite handy for what we want. The next two lines, lines 7 and 8, are all about creating the labels. The way in which tkinter works is we need to create a component and then pack it, and pack it places it on the screen. So this is a label that just says hello world, and we've packed it. And then underneath that, we've created a button called click me, which we've packed as well. Now, one of the first questions is, well, how do we get buttons to do things? Well, it's all through subroutines. So let's create a subroutine called update label. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the label to something else. I'm going to pop a line that says pass here a minute, just to show that I can change the text to an actual value from the variable. So there I've just updated the text of the label so it's reflected what the variable name. Now update label, all that's going to do is this. And what we need to do is add to the command for the button a second argument, which is command update label. It's a bit weird that we're not putting brackets on that, but there you go. So after telling the button to run the command, we also need to update the command so that it updates the label. The way we do that is we call the label by its variable name, which feels a bit weird because it's in a subroutine and we're calling a variable that hasn't yet been created, but it's okay. This is object orientation, really. This is things calling things that we definitely know should have happened before we get to press the button. And the key to that is that this subroutine isn't going to be called until the button's pressed. And we know that these things have already been defined before we even have the opportunity to make the button. This main loop code is what runs the program. So when I click this button here, it's going to go up and change the label value to by world and update the text, which means that if I click this, I can update the text on there, which means I can do a little bit more than that. Let's imagine that the label was actually a number, and let's add 1 to the label. You'll see that the label is 0, and now as I'm clicking it, you'll see I'm getting an error message. Well, that's interesting. And this is another issue with this kind of design. When I call a variable from within a subroutine, I do need to use a key value. So before I can use it, I need to call it with the word global. Now, what global means is I've actually defined this variable outside of my definition and I'd like to use it, please. Sometimes we need that to get things working. And in this case, I'm adding 1 to it. So I'm going to stop and run again. And as I say, click me now, you can see I'm adding 1 to it as we go. And as many times as I want to click that, the number will go up. Now I've created just a clicking game here, really, haven't I? Very, very simply and straightforwardly. But I've got a label and I've got a button. Now, what about somewhere to type text into? So a text box works like this. Now the argument to adding text, which is tk.text, is where it's going to go. In this case, the window, which is what we've called our window. The next is the height, and that's measured in characters, so the amount of letters tall it's going to be, and the amount of characters wide it's going to be. So in this case, I've got a place now that I can type letters or numbers into. Now let's imagine that we want to read something from that text. How could we do it? Well, let's imagine that we click the button, we're going to add this number to this number. Well, what we need to do is we need to access that. So we need to have this. We need to have number text, which is what we call the text box, .get. Now, at the moment that's not working. That's because get has two arguments, which are a bit weird. But the first argument is where do we start? And this has to be a decimal number in quotes. 1.0 is going to be from the first position. And then the second bit is how far do we go till the end? So if we stop and run this again now, it should take whatever we type in there and take that value. But what are we going to do with it? Well, let's take that value and let's turn it into an integer. I've done it this way just to stop that command getting too complicated. I'm then going to add to it what was in the box. Let's see if that works. There we go. Now I've got a system that can add arbitrary numbers together, which is quite nice. Of course, one of the major issues with our program at the moment is we're struggling about where to put things. This wouldn't make much sense for a lot of programs to have a button above the text box. And that can be fixed by changing the order in which we define them, certainly, by moving the button down and defining it after the text box. It will appear below it and work just the same. Well, do we still need this label is a question. So let's get rid of the label and let's see if we can update the text box instead. So let's start the text box with, instead of that, let's pack it with the label value to start with. So text.insert, we're going to say where we want to start it. I'm going to start it at 0, which is the beginning. What am I going to put in there? Well, I'm going to put the value of a label in. Then, instead of updating the label, I'm adding one to it, this method here, I'm going to do text.insert 0 label there and see what happens. So that needs to be 1.0, it's the same location. 5 in here, adding that value to it each time, and craziness is happening. So I'm going to go back to having my label in there because that's a little bit nicer to have. So how about the positioning of items then? Because that's quite important. Now, pack has some options which allows us to change where things are. If we take the button, we can add side as a variable and do tk.bottom. And what this will do is it will place that at the bottom of the window, which is quite handy for putting things in certain places. So that means if we take our text box and instead side equals tk.top, does this do what you think it does? I can move it to the left if we want. And notice now it's sort of spread it out a little bit. I could put it to the right if I wanted to, or I could put it to the top of the space that's available to it. If we take away the packing options, we can even pack things in a grid. So let's imagine that we had a couple of buttons. Let's put a few buttons in. So 3 buttons have been added, and by default, they're going to go one after the other. Let's see if we can put them in more of a grid formation. Well, immediately after we create the button, we can do .grid. Grid has a row and a column. So I'm going to say row equals 1, column equals 1. It's 0 indexed, so we're going to say 0 and 0. I'm going to take that and I'm going to add that to the next 2. And I'm going to increase the column. Now let's see what this does. Now, in order for this method to work, I need to completely remove pack from everywhere. So this means that my entire page is broken up into a grid. If I move those down to row 2, remember it's 0 indexed, I'm going to have my text, I have my label as row 0, column 1, and I'm going to have my text then as row 1, column 1. So it should look roughly as it did before. But now I've got 3 buttons arranged underneath. Don't forget we can't combine the pack method, which allows us to align top, left, right, and bottom with the grid method. So it's one or the other really, depending on how you want to lay it out. Common problems then. One of the most common problems you'll have is this, attribute error. Hello doesn't have the attribute pack. This is because sometimes you get used to adding pack. Even by default, we'll get some boilerplate code that has pack in it. Pack is a way of telling it to lay out the page and pack it all together. It doesn't work with grid. Even if you remove grid, you can't mix and match pack and grid together in different ways. So you either have to decide that everything's going to be a grid, or everything's going to be a pack. You can't do either or there. Okay, here's another problem then. When I click run and I click a button, I get an error. Now, here is a really common problem. It's one of the reasons why tkinter is not the most friendly thing in the world. It's because what was working when we did pack is now not working, that we've added these elements and we're using grid. Now, part of this problem, as you can see on line 11 here, getting the value from the text box is not working. It says none type object has no attribute get. Now, what that means is that an object that's set to none doesn't have any attributes. That makes sense, but we haven't set it to none, have we? Well, a problem comes the way we've used grid, because we've used it in line, because we've used .grid online with our text there. That's actually causing text to be nothing. It puts it on the screen, but sets it to nothing. What we need to do is create the text separately from setting the grid. And that's as simple as saying text.grid on the next line. Now, if I run it, I put a number in the box, I'm getting the same error, but for a different line. This is line 14 where I'm setting the label. Lo and behold, the label we put .grid in the same line. So let's move that down. So both of these now, I'm creating the variable which gives it a type and gives it something that I can reference later, and then I'm putting it on the screen. And you can see now it's all working. This is a frustration though, because you'll see loads of examples online where they just use .grid in line. If you need to manipulate it later, either accessing it to see within it or setting the value of it, you will need to define it separately, and you will need to set the grid position as a separate command. I've broken some code, so please go fix it for me. Your challenge today is to create a very, very simple calculator. I don't want a single text box in there. I want the numbers 0 to 9. I want the symbols multiply, divide, plus, minus, and equals. And I want you to set it all up so the calculator works like a real calculator would, giving me the output when I press equals. When you're done, share your code with us by publishing it in the community and using the hashtag Replit100daysofcode to share it on social media. Tomorrow, we'll look at adding images to tkinter, and hopefully you won't be pulling your hair out and looking more like me than you do already.